You're watching or listening to Film Club, and for the next 60 minutes, we're going to be talking about demon babies, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR, and alphabetically, by first name, anybody?
Hi, I'm Matt.
Simon, has your microphone stopped?
Yeah, and he's muted his microphone, which is ideal for a podcast.
Oh, he has as well.
Nice one, Lee. Lee, press un. That's better.
There we go.
And that's Lee. Say hello, Lee.
Hello, Lee.
Right. Now that you're unmuted. So we decided that for this year, or I decided, because I am the dictator and everybody hates me for it, I decided that this year for the Halloween special episode, we were going to be talking about demon babies. So we're heading back to the 1970s and even as far back as 1968 to talk about Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist and The Omen, and probably a very, very brief discussion about various sequels and remakes, I suppose. But the main concentration would just be on those three films. Let us start then with Rosemary's Baby. And the normal thing I do is I tend to go round and ask when we first saw these films. So Lee, we'll stay with alphabetical, and seeing as you've got your microphone still on, so I'll catch you before it goes off again. Lee, when did you first see Rosemary's Baby, and what did you think of it then? And we'll leave the what do you think of it now till we get into the main discussion.
I think I saw it in the 90s, so quite late. It was right on my street. It was.
When you say it was quite late, do you mean it was like after 10 p.m. or something?
It was quite. I think it was quite late in its time period to have seen it, considering how long I've been on this planet and how many horror films I was watching. It's one of the last ones I saw, really, of this kind of 70s, the big ones rather. And I held off with it because I just didn't think it was something that would necessarily appeal to me, and I was completely wrong,
Weird.
of course. Yeah, and I was really freaked out by it. It really, really got me. I got nightmares, which is a good thing for a horror film.
I think I must have seen it pretty early because I was quite aware of who Ira Levin was and things like the Stepford Wives. So I was already predisposed, I think, to be interested. And as I've spoken about before, I had this big sort of coffee table book, which was lots of pictures and lots of writing about horror films across the ages from the 1920s up until, I don't know, 1980s or whatever. And it featured fairly prominently in there. So I think I would have sought it out as soon as I was able to watch it on TV, probably in the 1980s. Simon, how about you?
I don't think I'd ever watched it all the way through before.
Oh, wow.
And I think in my memory, I don't think you've ever watched it. Yeah, I definitely haven't watched it all the way through. And I think in my memory, it kind of got jumbled up with watching Demon Seed.
Oh, yeah.
Which I really love. I love that film. And yeah, that's just reminded me that I need to seek a copy of that and watch that again because I love the idea of that film and really enjoyed it when I watched it on BBC Two years ago. So yeah, the memories all get jumbled up.
Well, that's next year's Halloween special sorted out. Matt, had you seen Rosemary's Baby before? I'm assuming you must have.
Yes, but like Lee, I think I saw it in the 90s, which actually was probably quite appropriate for me. I was probably about the right age to watch it, so I watched it in my teens. I didn't like it very much when I saw it the first time. I was sort of underwhelmed by it. I must have seen it around the same time as I saw The Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw and Witchfinder General. So Rosemary's Baby felt a bit sort of, it's very Polanski and very urban. So I didn't get on board, but I've kind of rewatched it a number of times since. And it's kind of got under my skin a bit more.
Okay, we'll stick with you then. We'll talk about what it's about and various things in a minute. But okay, as soon as you've said that, so you've sort of come around to it now then. And you watch it this week for this podcast, I take it?
Yeah, so I rewatched it. Yeah, but since I last watched it, I've watched a fair number more Roman Polanski films. So you can kind of, I mean, I think when I first watched it, I must have seen, I think I saw, is it Fearless Vampire Killers?
Yeah.
And I think I've seen Test of the D'Urbervilles and possibly the Macbeth, but that was it for Roman Polanski. But now I've seen things like Repulsion and Knife in the Water. it's
early
kind
ones,
of
yeah.
you can see the Polanski under Rosemary's Baby, so that kind of carries you forward.
This is kind of, I guess, the turning point between Polanski's early, often Polish films and what Polanski would become in the 70s, isn't it? I think this is the end of the sort of first phase of his career, really.
What, as somebody who hasn't seen many of his films, what would you say characterizes his films? I mean, I know him more from his doings, as it
I
were,
think,
the things he's got
yes.
up to, as opposed to his movies. So what would you say characterizes?
I think he's an absurdist, but I think his subjects deceive you into not expecting that of his movies. So I think his films share that in common, say, for example, with the Coen brothers or even Stanley Kubrick a bit. If you watch a Stanley Kubrick movie, often they're very serious subjects, but treated in a slightly absurd, larger than life way. And I think most of Polanski's work is underpinned by this slightly absurdist aesthetic, which, as Matt will testify, comes bubbling right to the surface in something like The Fearless Vampire Killers. But even in Rosemary's Baby, although it's like a psychological horror film, I think it's also slightly weird in a sort of bizarre, slightly darkly humorous, and definitely slightly oddly characterized way. So that when I'm watching Rosemary's Baby, I'm never under any illusion that I'm doing anything other than watching a movie. But at the same time, because this absurdism sort of underpins everything, I think it builds this sort of coherent universe for the characters to exist in, so that you buy into all of the weird, bizarre things that are happening to them. And often he'll use things like Terry Gilliam does with fisheye lenses and stuff like that. I think Terry Gilliam often goes too far. I think Roman Polanski, he will use stuff like that, but he never goes anywhere nearly as far as Terry Gilliam does, apart from in The Fearless Vampire Killers. So I think he manages to hold this absurdist line, but do it in a subtle enough way that, like I say, I think he deceives you into not realizing that that's what he's doing. I don't know, Matt, how do you feel about it?
Oh, I think that makes sense, but I think that's early Polanski. So I think Rosemary's Baby, he does occasionally go back. I think Frantic, the film with Harrison Ford, is it?
Yeah.
He goes back a bit to that, but after Rosemary's Baby, it becomes more kind of prestige productions, and it sort of loses that edge. I think Darren Aronofsky is a close.
Have you ever seen? Yeah.
So Mother is the thing that I was thinking of when I'm watching, particularly Rosemary's Baby. You can see.
Have you ever seen Bitter Moon though? Because Polanski goes very heavily back into that early absurdism in Bitter Moon, for example.
Yeah, so he slips back into it.
Yeah. But yeah, when he does things like Chinatown, you don't necessarily notice it. But then if you go back and think about Chinatown afterwards, for instance, the bit where Jack Nicholson gets his nose cut by Roman Polanski, actually, in one of his very few acting parts. That's, again, very absurdist piece of cinema, that scene there. But we're not really here to talk about Polanski. We will no doubt do Polanski in more depth at another time. But Simon, okay, no, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go to Lee first and come back to you, Simon, since you're the one who's kind of watched it properly for the first time this time. Lee, what do you think of Rosemary's Baby?
I watched it again this week, and it's insidious, isn't it? I mean, it really does get under your skin.
Yeah.
And the reason being, obviously, you are with Rosemary through the entire film, and you can feel her change. You can feel her vulnerabilities. You can feel her abuse, emotionally, sexually, everything. She's a totally abused person. She's got all of her rights stripped away as a woman, and all her friends disappear. She is a carriage for the devil, and it's really, you just want her to get out of it. And right to the very end of the film, you're still hoping she'll just turn around and go, I'm off, or I'm going to kill the baby or something. But you're left with this strange moment of, she smiles slightly, and it's ambiguous, but not quite. It's almost like she's completely accepted the fact there's no way out. She's going to just deal with this, or it's a moment of her final kind of true control. It's like, if I'm going to be a mother, I'm going to be a mother. At least I can control this one thing, because she can't control anything else in her life. But just on the absurdist front, the first half of that film doesn't feel like that. The second half does, and you get this almost comedic, like you say, dark comedic moments with the cult, with the coven. You know, bits where the knife drops on the floor and the woman kind of rubs to the floor, thinking, "Oh, that knife falling into the floor." You've got
Yeah.
this lovely coziness of people's lives. They're so used to the satanic thing and tea parties. It's really, you know, it's really extreme and
That's the
bizarre.
obvious stuff, but I think it's there throughout in much less obvious ways, just in the performances and sometimes in, you know, his choices about where to put the camera and when to move the camera. He makes what seems like odd choices if you stop and think about them. But while the film's happening, they all seem very natural. So if you watch something like Cul-de-sac, that's very surrealist. But at the same time, it's so surrealist all the way through. And it's years since I've seen it, so Matt will remember this better than I do. But as I remember it, it's so surreal all the way through that you, after a few minutes, you just accept it and you accept the characters and you accept that the relationship between the characters and the camera, and it just becomes natural and it just becomes organic. And I think that's his thing. And I do think that's all the way through this. But Simon, okay, Rosemary's Baby. Now that you've seen it, what did you think?
It's very much of its time, and certainly some of the acting. I mean, Mia Farrow for me carries the whole thing, carries you through. I think she, if you can focus on her and completely buy into what she's going through. The characters around her are very much caricaturish. I don't know if that's intentional or not. But that would
given
certainly
everything I've just said, yeah.
Yeah, that would net into the idea that these are people who have kind of transcended normality, and well, their normality is something very different from ours. But you know, you can read a lot into it. I don't know to what extent things in there are intentional or not. Obviously, there's the idea of organized religion, and the idea that, you know, there are groups of people who get together who think that you know, what they believe is what's normal, and everyone else is a bit strange. And so that's going on. But equally,
Well,
I think Mia Farrow's journey is, you know, you could actually say that this is just one massive allegory for what women go through when they have babies, that they become isolated, that they feel separate from everyone else, that they feel there's tons of pressure from society as well as from the family and surrounding people.
yeah. There is that. And I think going back to what Lee said about the ending, I think the way it ends is the mother accepting the child and realizing the relationship between the two.
But also that idea that all the pain that she's gone through suddenly dissipates, and there's this clarity about what's important, and the importance is the child. It is a little bit. I did a little thing in the back of my head, had this Monty Python voice saying, "Oh, he's lovely after all. Oh, he may be the son of Satan, but I love him anyway." You know, it's a bit.
It's the whole thing, though. It's based on a book by Ira Levin that had only just come out the year before. Oh, the year before this was released. So this was in production, you know, within a year of the novel having come out. And the point is, this is while the counterculture revolution is going on. And I think a huge part of what Rosemary's Baby is Ira Levin, an established author, reacting against the counterculture revolution. I think this is very much against the sort of hippie ideals. And I think the Satanists in this kind of, and you know, you can't really look at a piece of art that came out in the latter half of the 1960s without watching it through this prism, because this was so ubiquitous, the sort of counterculture thing, that basically all art is influenced by it, whether it thinks so or not. So I think Rosemary's Baby, I think the sort of cultists in Rosemary's Baby kind of basically represent hippies, and the idea maybe, and if you view it through a modern eyes, I think it sort of makes a connection between a kind of toxic masculinity and hipsterism, a kind of fetishization of the past. And I think that's what Rosemary's Baby is about. It's saying maybe these hippies are sort of fetishizing a sort of fake naturalness, and this sort of Satan thing represents this sort of fake naturalness that I think Rosemary herself stands in opposition to, and obviously the author of the book stands in opposition to, because he makes her your identification character. And I think he's just basically it idealizes normalcy in the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? If we sort of accept change in the culture around us rather than hoping for things to stand still, if you see what I mean. And I think the cultists in this are kind of trying to make things stand still. And if the devil comes out and the devil turns up, I think the idea is that the world goes backwards. So I think that big sort of analogy or metaphor at the heart of this is between, evolution, change. What's the word I'm looking for? Where things move on. What's the word I'm after?
Oh, evolution's a good one.
Progress.
Yeah, but not evolution. Progress. It's about progress versus regression, and I think the cultists stand on the side of regression against the progress of society. So it's an it's a pro-society narrative in that the protagonists or the antagonists in the narrative are anti-society. If you see what I mean, Matt, you've got something to say about that?
Yeah, almost completely the opposite. The antagonist,
that's-
the cult represents the establishment. So they're all
Do you think so?
older. They're doctors, surgeons. They've all got professions. And these sort of bohemian artists move into the apartment, and they're kind of preyed upon by the establishment. So the Satanist cult is effectively Nixon's sort of silent majority voters who
Yeah,
are presented as this kind of corrupt.
Well, this
that's
was the time. This was the time when the Church of Satan just came out, wasn't it? I can't remember the guy's name, but he created the Church of Satan. And if you think about the fact that everybody in this film, if you just take the Satanist,
Anton LaVey.
thank you. If you just, I knew you'd know that. If you just take the Satanist side of it away and just replace it with the church, then actually there's not much difference to, say, if Rosemary was carrying the next Son of God, and everybody in there was just having tea parties and all with God. So he's simply taken the idea and just switched it around his head in amongst the period of massive change. I mean, what was it, 66, 67, 68? Massive change, like you say, JR, which also is indicated, when she cuts her hair off and becomes this new girl.
Yeah, I think Matt's misunderstanding me then, because the change, well, whatever. We could go on down this rabbit hole for an hour.
I think the point you're trying to make is that Rosemary's essentially given birth to Nigel Farage. Is that right?
She's given birth to Richard Nixon, who becomes president in the next year.
Oh, right.
It's interesting that the church doesn't really appear in this, though, especially when we're about to talk about another film where the church plays a prominent role, and also released in the same year as The Devil Rides Out, which is very similar to Rosemary's Baby, but obviously the film was made at the same time, but the books much earlier must have been an influence to IR11. And again, the church is absent from the Devil Rides Out. So the main hero is an occultist who's combating this group of sort of middle to upper class establishment Satanists who gather round at a country house to bring forth Batmatet. So
the other interesting point about this film is that there's no horror, there's no gore, there's nothing like that at all, apart from two main scenes, which I suppose is the end and the bit where she's raped by the devil. But even then, she's under the influence of drugs, 60s, and also she has a few dreams which are a bit psychedelic, 60s. So you haven't really got much horror going on. So most of it, like you say, Jay, is done with oblique, weird camera angles, the music, the beautiful music, the haunting music that's being played, paranoia. There's a whole lot of paranoia going on, and also you can almost think that it's all in her head in a way, until the very last bit.
Yeah, I don't think Rosemary's Baby thinks it's a horror film. That's kind of the point.
No.
And all three of the films that we're talking about here, for one reason or another, don't just fit straight into that sort of horror category. They're not like Hammer movies. They're not like Universal movies. They're not like the slasher movies of the decade that followed. They're not even. They're a bit like when Hitchcock did Psycho. that's become established as a horror movie because of the copycat movies that came afterwards. These three movies that we're talking about in this episode kind of establish a genre in a way, don't they? But in and of themselves, they're all quite they're quite sort of well-to-do, well-funded movies from major studios that don't think of themselves as being sort of exploitation pictures.
I'd say that's true about two of them. I'd say Rosemary's Baby is Polanski's making a Polanski film first.
Yes.
And The Exorcist is William Friedkin making a because William Friedkin's got a huge ego, so he's making a William Friedkin film. I think maybe the third one is actually intended to be let's cause your children to wet their beds film.
But I think there's a case to be made that The Omen is basically an action movie in the same genre as The Exorcist, rather than a horror movie per se. But we'll get to it. In fact, we'd better keep moving, otherwise we're going to be talking for absolutely hours. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up about Rosemary's Baby, or should we give it a score and get on to The Exorcist?
Only that I bought the sequel. So Ira Levin wrote a sequel in the 1990s called Son of Rosemary. So I'm going to read that at some point.
Oh, wow.
Unconnected with the film sequel or the TV movie sequel, which I haven't seen.
Yeah. Okay. I wasn't even aware there was one. Simon.
I wanted to say my favourite moment was the bit near the end where she walks into the room with all the strange people and the guy with the camera and all that sort of thing, and then she looks across to the husband, and the husband kind of looks away and covers his face. And I thought that was I really like that bit. I just thought that was quite I don't know. It was really odd. I thought it was odd the way that the husband had kind of been brought into it all, and still at the end he still had some shame. So
I think it's cathartic, isn't it, that bit? Because actually, when you're on the side of Rosemary, you know that John Cassavetes is abusing her and gaslighting her, and certainly for a modern audience, that is so frustrating that you want to see him have his comeuppance, and actually being ashamed and being found out is one of those moments of comeuppance that he gets. So it's actually quite satisfying.
He, by the way, Simon, John Cassavetes, basically invented independent cinema. He's better known as a director than as an actor. He went off and did, while he was acting in a movie, and then he'd go off and direct a movie, and his directed movies, basically, I don't know, I would say, yeah, I'm exaggerating when I say invented independent cinema, but they are so indie. They're quite surprising to behold to a modern audience, given when they were made. Anyway, Rosemary's Baby. Lee, what are you going to give it out of 10?
I'm going to give it an 8, and that's on the rewatch. I think on the first one, probably about a 7.
Fair enough. Matt?
I'm going to give it an 8.
Okay.
Based on the fact I know I'm going to be scoring the other two movies after this. So
fair enough. Well, I'm going to give it a 9 because Rosemary's Baby's always been one of my favourite Polanskis, and one that I can go back to time after time. And every time I go back to it, I still think it works. It still makes you feel for the character, and it still makes you dread the ending. Simon, out of 10.
I don't feel like I really connected with it, so I will probably give it a 7. I could appreciate it, but I don't think I connected with it.
Right, The Exorcist then. And so this was really interesting for me because I've seen The Exorcist twice and I hated it both the first 2 times. And I promised I would come back to The Exorcist for this podcast and rewatch it again and see if I could see what everybody else sees in it. So I'll get back to me in a couple of minutes. But yeah, I saw it for the second time a couple of years ago. And the first time I saw it was probably back in the 1990s. And yeah, I really, really didn't get the fuss when I first saw it. And I still didn't get the fuss when I second saw it. Simon, had you seen The Exorcist before?
Yes. I didn't actually get around to watching it this week, but I had watched it fairly recently in the last couple of years. I first watched it about 12, 13 years ago, and much the same as you, I was a bit nonplussed by it and thought this is a bag of gas. This is not anything that people think it is. But the second time I watched it, I kind of bought into it and had a completely different experience. And I wouldn't say enjoyed it, but I certainly bought into it in much the same way as some people bought into Blair Witch. Not in as much as believing it, but in as much as taking it as a documentary in my head, and it changed the experience, and I really enjoyed it.
Lee,
No, did I enjoy it? I don't know. Yeah, it's one of those. I don't know whether I enjoyed it or not. I just kind of experienced it. So yeah, sorry.
Go on then, Lee. How about you?
Yeah, I think I saw it in the early 90s, maybe 1990. It was before Rosemary's Baby anyway. And then I watched it, and like Simon, I didn't know what the fuss was all about, or whoever said it first. And I was thinking, okay, yeah, that's an all right horror movie. It's fine, 5 out of 10 maybe, something like that. Then I read the book, which was much better reading that actually, because then I realised it was based upon not a true story, but a story that is supposedly true of a boy who was possessed, and that really made it better for me to get into it. So I rewatched it again in the late 90s, and then enjoyed it much more, knowing the story a bit more. And recently watched it for this podcast, and really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. I just sat there thinking, how can I have thought this wasn't very good the first time I watched it? I absolutely love it. Apart from the spinning head bit, everything else in it is, but apart from that, it's excellent. And I think the whole thing about it is that I know from the history of the
Lee,
film.
you're into the bit that we do after we've been around.
No, but you're asking me my reaction, how I feel watching it recently, and
no, I'm asking you how you felt watching it the first time. I'm going to ask you how you felt watching it recently.
Let's go back in time. That was never said. You didn't hear any of
that. We'll come back to it. Matt.
I wasn't paying attention to Lee anyway. I first saw this in the cinema, so I don't know how Lee saw it in 1990, because when I was growing up, this was the great lost film that you couldn't get hold of, or I couldn't get hold of, and then it was re-released for the first time after it had been allowed to be.
I saw it on pirate video. Why wasn't it not around then?
I didn't get hold of a pirate video, so I saw it in the cinema for the first time in about 98, and I think because of that, it had more of an impact on me. Partly because I'd read the book beforehand, and we knew we were all talking about it as being this sort of lost film that nobody had seen, and so this was our big opportunity to see it. So yeah, I saw it in the Exeter Picture House.
Can you check the facts on that, JR? When was it?
Oh no, I remember this. Now that Matt's brought it up, I'd completely forgotten. But yeah, for years and years and years, The Exorcist was never available on home video, was it? I don't think.
Yeah.
I must have watched it whenever it came out then.
Wasn't there a showing on BBC Two with Mark Kermode introducing? Or was that fairly recent?
That would have been after, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of those movies. It wasn't that it was illegal to watch it, but it was that because, for some reason, it may have been religious. For some reason, they wouldn't put it out onto home video. So I'm not sure whether it may have turned up on television or something.
It was available from 81 to 84. Then the Video Recordings Act in 84, it didn't get a certificate, and it remained unavailable for purchase until 99, but it was re-released in cinemas in 98, and then it got on home video after that, 99.
I definitely saw it in the early 90s then in that case.
And then shown on terrestrial television in 2001 on Channel 4.
And that was the first time it was shown on terrestrial TV.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. That was probably when I first saw it then, 2001. Okay, so I'm going to get my bit out of the way, and then I'm going to let you guys talk, because my problem is not with William Peter Blatty, and it's probably not with the script. I think William Friedkin's a terrible filmmaker. I think he makes really poor choices. I think he makes really poor choices when it comes to editing. I think it makes really poor choices when it comes to pacing. I think his compositions are terrible. I think a lot of his choices are just really shockingly bad, and they throw me out of the movie time after time. I had exactly the same experience watching The French Connection. I just couldn't watch that movie except through a haze of tearing my hair out with all these weird choices. It's just like he has no idea what to do with the camera and how to relate the camera to the actors, and he's just, he's throwing the camera around, or else he's not throwing the camera around, or else he's choosing really weird places to stand with the camera. I don't know if it's him or the people he works with. There are important things disappearing off the screen when they shouldn't be. There are sort of sequences where people are moving and the camera suddenly can't follow them or follow them all the time. The first 10 minutes of this movie is this sort of sequence that takes place somewhere else, which I'm sure makes 100% sense in the book. I get to the end, all 3 times I've watched it, I've got to the end of this sort of prologue sequence and thought, well, I've no idea what that was, but I'm sure it'll make sense when I get through the rest of the film. And about 5 minutes from the end of the film, all I can think is, well, that prologue's really not going to make any sense, is it? Because the prologue just seems to exist in order to exist. So the film has this bit at the start that's not the same as the rest of the film. I can't work out what it's for. I'm sure in the book, the prologue will make complete sense. And given that one of the characters comes in, Karras, and his mother dies, I'm sure there's supposed to be some kind of connection between the emotional lives of the characters. But I can't thread the dots together, for want of a mixed metaphor. Nothing in this adds up to any kind of sense to me. So in the end, it just becomes to me a sequence of scenes where things are happening to characters that I don't believe in, don't buy into, and feel no peril for. And I tell you the thing that really undermines it for me, and then I'll hand over to you 3 guys. We're going to talk about The Omen, and we talked about Rosemary's Baby. And in both The Omen and Rosemary's Baby, whatever you think about The Omen, the devil appears with a purpose. In The Exorcist, the devil inhabits a small girl to no other purpose than to inhabit a small girl. This is the devil. This is supposed to be, the anti-god. This is supposed to be, potentially the second biggest being in creation. Why does he inhabit a small girl just for the sake of inhabiting a small girl? He doesn't do it to any purpose. And if I can't see his purpose in the film, I can't buy into the fact that he's in the film. So I just can't buy into the premise of the film. So The Exorcist, I couldn't buy into the filmmaking, and I couldn't buy into the premise of the picture. So the entire thing, for the 3rd time, despite the fact that I went in really wanting to like it and see what everybody else saw, just completely confounded me, and I was left utterly cold by it.
I heard an interview with Satan once, and he just said, "It's a laugh, innit?"
I mean, it might help to know that it's not Satan in this. It's just a demon. It's like a low-level demon, so it's not
Even
the
if
devil.
It's a low-level demon.
And
Why a small girl?
That's made quite clear because she's vulnerable. I mean, I think the good thing for you about The Omen is The Omen spoon feeds all of these things to us and makes it quite clear. The Omen 2 has exactly the same kind of prologue at the beginning with Leo McKern.
And it's rubbish.
And it's rubbish. But here, actually, the prologue does something. It makes sense. It shows this is about character building. This is showing Merrin in an archaeological, it's sort of encountering sort of images of this demon before he comes back. And Karras's death, again, that's character build. Karras's mother's death, that's character building because he's living with the guilt of it, which is shown in the film. So by the time you get to the climax of The Omen, that's how the climax makes sense because Karras sacrifices himself for the girl. So it all kind of holds together. I don't think there's anything unclear about it. And editing is one of Friedkin's the best things about this film. It's so well edited. It's like, I mean, I'd agree. I'm not actually that big a fan of The Exorcist. I'm not a Mark Kermode. So I think the pacing is off on this. I think it starts really slowly. It's creeping along, and you're thinking this is quite good. It's creeping along, and then suddenly it goes back crap crazy, and head starts spinning around. And that moment doesn't happen it doesn't sort of happen incrementally. That just suddenly happens. Reagan suddenly goes from slightly possessed to completely possessed. And I think that's a flaw of the film.
There are about 3 or 4 minutes in there just before that where I suddenly get involved with the character and I start to feel slightly unnerved. And then as soon as that stuff starts happening, it just swings completely into reverse.
I mean, the creepiest part of this film is the medical examination. For me,
yeah,
that's a really horrible sequence where an actual serial killer is playing the part of one of the doctors. Did anybody know this? This is one of the mythology of The Exorcist. One of the actors in the medical examination ended up being arrested as a serial killer.
Lee, what did you think of The Exorcist then now?
In amongst all the other accidents that happen on set on this film.
Yeah.
Oh, The Exorcist. Okay, so I really liked it this time around. I really, really liked it. And I think I liked it because I like B movies anyway. I like horror films. I like stupid things. It's the weakest of the three that we're talking about tonight by far. No, it is. It just is. It just is. It's not. It is.
You've got The Omen coming up. The ultimate
Omen's
in
genius,
B
shut up.
movies. The
Anyway,
Omen
so-
is the B movie to The Exorcist. That's the whole point.
I believe it's my turn. I'm just saying.
Makes
It's a game.
sense then.
It's a game of two halves, isn't it? Really, like JR said, you got the first half and then the second half, which is batshit crazy, and I love all of that. I do love it, but this is a. I think what it is, it made such a storm at the cinema. People were coming out sick. They were like the Blair Witch. You all like going, oh, I feel ill. I can't see that, and they were crying, and people were fainting, literally fainting, and they had smelling salts at the door. And this isn't a myth. This was actually the truth. So they're bringing people around because it was such an incredibly dangerous film to watch. It felt for people going in. I'm not sure The Omen had that same effect, but anyway, it really, really kind of blew everybody's minds at how bonkers and bizarre it was, and it's based on a true story and all this sort of thing. But its myth has built so high that people are looking at it going, oh, this is the scariest film. It's an absolute classic. Jewel is better than this film. There are films that are so much better for me as a classic, as a legendary piece of filmmaking than this film. But I still really bloody love it. It does. It just needs a really good. I'm sorry, Matt, but it needs a good edit. It just needs to be compacted a bit more in the first half, and then you'd have more of a pace going on. And that first part that we see in the desert, I mean, it is needed. There is a small link between bits and pieces going on in the film, but really, it just gives you that feeling that this is a global issue, that this no, what am I talking about? It should give you a feeling it's a global issue, but actually it then becomes very insular and domestic. So it shouldn't actually be there, should it? Doesn't feel right. It's like Indiana Jones. Jones. It's like Indiana Jones going all the way to the desert, right, fighting off all these Germans and Nazis, traveling across the world, finding the Ark, and then basically bringing it home to his house for an hour and opening it up, and then them all having a party with the Ark.
But don't you think there's something unsettling about opening in Iraq and having this sort of exterior scene and then flipping to Georgetown?
No, I love
having
it.
this kind of Rosemary's Baby stuff.
No,
that's the point.
I love it.
It's really interesting that Lee's brought up Indiana Jones, because in the back of my mind I was thinking, God, I know what this is a cousin of. This is a cousin of Close Encounters. I think it's got the same shape as Close Encounters, with a lot of these supposedly disparate events and it all coming together. Yeah, it doesn't work anywhere near as well as Close Encounters. And maybe if Spielberg had been around at that time and done it instead.
Wow.
And look at Matt's reaction.
Poltergeist. Just watch Poltergeist.
I love Poltergeist.
Yeah, Spielberg didn't direct Poltergeist, though, did he? He produced it, didn't he? Yeah, all right. I'm splitting hairs here, but I just think it's a cousin, and I get kind of the same feeling from Close Encounters, where it's kind of close to documentary, and it's played in such a way that these are real events happening in front of you. As ridiculous as some of it is, I know, but everyone plays it straight. In which case you can buy into it and you can experience the film, as opposed to sitting there saying this is a bit silly, isn't it? And for the time you're watching the film, you're immersed in it. So yeah.
Anybody want to bring anything else up, or should we score this and talk about the sequels for about 2 minutes or something? I've not seen the sequels.
Oh.
I hear the sequels are so weird and mad that I'm absolutely fascinated to watch them, but I have never enjoyed The Exorcist enough to want to go on and watch more.
Somebody told me The Exorcist 3 was better than The Exorcist 2. Is that correct?
So
apparently, yeah, go on, Matt.
Exorcist 2 is rubbish. That's the John Borman one.
Apparently, Exorcist 2 turns everything in The Exorcist on its head. Is that right? In a way?
Not really. It's just I've only seen it once because it's so bad. But it ends with the house being destroyed and sucked into a sort of a vortex. So it's got a kind of an Evil Dead feel at the end. but it really plays up this kind of mythology and this weird sort of surreal mythology behind The Exorcist, which doesn't really work. It might be rediscovered as a classic, but it hasn't yet. The Exorcist 3 is sort of completely separate. It's a bit like Halloween 3.
Oh, right.
But with kind of little links to The Exorcist. And it is mad. It's got George C. Scott, and it's directed by Blatty. So it's got kind of weird dream sequences and a really good jump cut. And then there are 2 prequels, one of which is Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader did one sequel, and the studio disliked it so much they got Renee Harlin. Is it Renee Harlin?
Really?
Renee Harlin?
Yeah.
They got, I think it was him, in to redo it. So he kind of used half of it that had already been shot and shot his own thing. So his one was released, and then Schrader's was released as this great lost classic, and neither of them were very good. And I've seen
Harlan started off in the Nightmare on Elm Street or the Halloweens or something. He started off in low budget horror movies, didn't he? So
yeah,
that kind of makes sense. Yeah.
And then there's a recent two season TV series, the first season of which is actually really good. I really enjoyed it, and that's a kind of mashup of The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, all sort of, it sort of cherry picks from all of these types of films, and it looks as though it's going to be a reboot of The Exorcist, but it actually turns out to be a sequel, as a kind of a, not as a twist, but it sort of becomes a sequel halfway through. So I think that's worth watching.
Right, I'm going to give The Exorcist 5 because I just don't see what everybody else sees. But I'm being generous. I could have gone lower, but I'm going to give it a 5. Lee,
I'm going to go for a 7, but I feel like I really need to watch the other 4 films now to get a well-rounded view.
Matt.
Or 4. I'm going to give it a 9. Partly, I'm never a massive fan of The Exorcist, but every time we've talked about it on the podcast before, and every time we talk about it, I like it a bit more. You can
just being belligerent.
Being iconoclastic.
Because everything JR says, I think the opposite of that. I think that's a good bit of it, and I think that works really well about it. So it just bumps it up in my opinion.
Simon.
I couldn't tell you why, but it's a 7.
Fair enough.
You 3 should have scored it 6.
6, 6, and 6. That's what we're planning to do on the next one.
Good.
9, 9, and 9. But I'll show you the piece of paper upside down, and it'll look like 3 6s.
Well, in fact, it's dialing the police to try.
Well, it may be. Okay, so The Omen. Clearly, somebody at 20th Century Fox looked at The Exorcist and said, let's have some of that. But they got somebody to sit down and write a script that was more like it's not like an action movie. So when I say it's like an action movie, what I don't mean is it's just filled with action and action sequences. But what I mean is it functions in the same way as an action movie does. In other words, there are certain sequences that the movie has to get to, from one to another. And the way the movie gets to those sequences is kind of a little bit like a game of chess. In other words, the writer has sat down and he's moving pieces around on a board until all the pieces are lined up for the finale of the movie. So The Omen is very much movie making by numbers, and it's directed by Richard Donner, who had directed Superman the movie and goes on and makes things like that helicopter thing with Clint Eastwood that I can't even be bothered to dredge up the name of.
Firefox.
Firefox, exactly. It's not a great movie. I saw it when I was the right age to be really impressed by it. So I guess I saw this by the time I was about 14 or 15, I think, because this was the big sort of horror movie of this sort of period between Psycho and the dawn of the slasher. This was the big horror movie that it was acceptable to show on telly and that you could watch as a kid, apart from a few gory bits, and not really be too shocked by. So yeah, the first time I saw The Omen was probably very early, sometime in the early 80s, I would imagine, mid 80s maybe. And I really enjoyed it then. Matt, go on then. When did you first see
I quite like it. I quite enjoy it. I think when I first watched it, must have been in the 90s. So I was later, but possibly a similar age as you. I think when I was that age, actually horror had moved on. So this was kind of heritage horror, and I was more frightened of. So Nightmare on Elm Street was the thing I grew up terrified of, just terrified of the trailers. So The Omen was kind of a quaint sort of. The Omen was like a Hammer movie for me at that stage, and that's just after like maybe 10 years difference. But I remember watching it and really enjoying it.
Lee?
It's profoundly affected me. I watched it in the 80s, and yeah, it's one of the scariest films I've ever seen. I still watch it now, and I have tingles down the back of my spine. It's probably quaint to other people, but to me, when I first watched it, it's one of those I couldn't sleep for days or weeks. It really turned me on to investigating the occult, actually, and things like that.
Well, the stuff that really worked for me, that really sent the shivers down my spine, was the stuff with the photographer.
Yeah.
So when the things start turning up on the photographs, and then he shows you the room with the Bible papered all over the walls. So then it starts, and that's where The Omen is a little bit like something like All the President's Men, where in the middle of it, it sort of turns a bit into a conspiracy thriller. So it's doing that as well. But anyway, Simon, when did you first see this?
I didn't see it all the way through. I seem to remember it being shown late night on ITV or something like that after my mum and dad had fallen asleep. So I saw the bits, and I think I probably saw it up to the point where Patrick Troughton gets done in, and it's like, oh, Doctor's dead. It was that sort of age. And then I watched it properly a few years later, probably late at night when I was, obviously a bit older, and watched it through. I thought it was okay. I thought it was all right. I think it's, yeah. We'll talk about it properly in a minute, but I thought it was all right.
I'll go on to talk about it properly now. So,
well, like I was saying, The Exorcist is kind of a cousin of Close Encounters. This for me is more like a cousin of Final Destination. Yeah. In as much as it's totally, the most interesting thing is the way that everyone dies, and that's what I remember. Yeah. But I can't honestly say that I had an experience like Lee. Probably because I was a bit older when I watched it, so I probably didn't take it in quite the same. And I don't find Gregory Peck particularly magnetic central actor at all. I really struggled with his performance. It was also so much grimacing. I just couldn't. I couldn't care.
He holds the film purely on account of who he is, really. But it's the actors around him that they bring in to sort of fill in all the smaller parts that really make the movie. So whenever Gregory Peck's in a scene with Patrick Troughton, you're more interested in Troughton. Whenever he's in a scene with David Warner, you're more interested in Warner. Whenever he's in a scene with Lee Remick, you're more interested in Remick.
Oh, it's a real shame David Warner wasn't the central actor in it. It really is. He's the best thing in it.
I didn't watch The Omen for this podcast because I've seen it many times. I watched the remake instead, which actually I quite like. But Liev Schreiber is exactly like Gregory Peck. He's the least interesting thing in it, and he's surrounded. Mia Farrow plays the underused demonic nanny in the remake. Pete Postlethwaite is in it instead of Patrick Troughton, and what's his name, David Thewlis instead of David Warner, and they're all much better than Liev Schreiber is this sort of Black American. I think this is less chess and more snakes and ladders. So I don't see this as being an intricately put together film. I see this as being a roller coaster film. And like Simon says, it's Final Destination. It's like the prototype of Final Destination, which is fine, but it's, it is just going from set piece to set piece to set piece, trying to up it.
Oh, the point I was making was that you need scenes in between that link between the set pieces that say, let's go to this geographical location and this thing will happen to us when we get there. And that's basically how it works. A slight note on the sequels. The first of the sequels that we've already mentioned is just the set pieces with bare minimum of linking narration. And that shows what The Omen might have been if the linking narration was less strong. I think the linking narration in this movie is strong enough that it does glue it together in a satisfying way.
I quite like The Omen too. I rewatched that as well. It is just a sequence of set pieces, but they are really good. They are really good ones.
I watched The Omen 2 and 3 about a year ago, yeah. And yeah, I didn't not enjoy it, but it is a far inferior film, I think.
So you can categorize how successful or what type of film it is by what you remember. So The Omen 2, I remember there's a bit with the ice and a bit with a lift. Omen 3, I remember there's a bit with an iron, like a steam iron, and that's pretty much all I remember from Omen 3.
And that's got what's his face from Jurassic Park in it as well.
Yeah,
Neil.
Yeah, he's really good. This conversation seems to be wandering around all over the place. Lee, what do you think of The Omen now?
I still love it. I still find it scary. I can't get out of my childlike kind of horror from it, which I'm glad of, because otherwise I'd be like some of the people on this podcast who can't seem to quite understand the fact that it's a horror film. So you have set pieces, you have points where people die. Every single horror film ever made has a moment where people are dying. You can have Attack of the Leeches. You have 4 points.
Baby,
yeah.
Wait, that's not a horror. That's not in my book a horror film. That should be a horror film, is it? It's a much bigger film than a horror film. What I mean is, Nightmare on Elm Street, full of set pieces. Friday the 13th, full of set pieces. Halloween, full of set pieces. It's no different.
Movies have got one thing in common, Lee.
They're horror films.
They all came along after this. It was this.
Not Night of the Leeches.
Films like Psycho. Sorry?
Not Night of the Leeches and all those other B movies.
Well, a lot of those B movies didn't have set pieces in the way this has set pieces. Like you say,
but they all
Final Destination. The Final Destination comparison is absolutely valid because The Omen, it's not the first film ever to do it, but I think The Omen is, because of when it happens at the same time as things like Halloween and Friday the 13th are just on the horizon. And I think The Omen is quite influential in setting up the idea of a horror movie will be a series of set pieces linked by a narration. I think this is quite influential.
So in that case, if it's that influential, it is in fact a fantastic and brilliant horror film, which is exactly what it's supposed to be. So you're not looking for the war peace underneath this. It's not. Rosemary's Baby is much more cerebral, much more clever, much more echo in society. This isn't doing any of that. It's got a slight bit of the society side of it in there, but not much. It's all about the biblical end of times. And
Lee seems to think that we're disagreeing with him, but I'm not. I think I agree that this is a really strong horror film because of its set pieces, but I think this is a really good B movie.
Yes,
but I don't think Rosemary's Baby and I don't think The Exorcist is a B movie. I think Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist are legitimate movies that happen to have horrific elements in it. This is a horror movie.
Agree. It has that sequence of anticipation before the death. So there's a build up to the death. That's why I say about the Final Destination thing, because you're kind of, you can almost do a drinking game. You take a drink when the next person's about to get knocked off.
Do you know what really kills it for me though as an adult is the one bit that really, really terrified me as a child was the bit in the graveyard. But now as an adult, when I watch it, as soon as they get to the graveyard, all I can think is, oh shit, they've gone into a film set.
Yeah. The most terrifying part of that film for me, and it just never left me, was when he was driving to the church and he just has a flip out. And I read later the reason why they chose the child. You know the story. The reason why they chose the child for the film is
because he had a birthmark with 3 sixes on the top of his head.
It's because he kicked the director in the bollocks in the audition. And they went, "We'll have him."
Nice. Can you believe this is from the same guy who did Superman the movie and half of Superman 2, just like a couple of years before?
I kind of can, because I think Richard Donner is a great is a great versatile director. He's just not got a particularly distinctive.
No,
I wouldn't say something's a big Donner movie. I think
no.
And that's why Superman is is good with him, and when Richard Lester comes along, you can tell it's a Richard Lester film that happens to feature Superman, which is great if you like Richard Lester, which I do, but it's not so good if you just want a Superman film.
No.
Richard Donner would be great if he was still alive. Is he dead now?
Oh, I should imagine so. In fact, I think he died relatively recently, didn't he?
That's right. Yeah, because
About a year and a half ago or something. Oh no, actually earlier this year, July this year.
Yeah, very recently. So he'd be making kind of DC movies or Marvel movies today.
I'm not even sure he would. I think he's maybe he would be making Marvel movies. I think DC's still a little bit more idiosyncratic, not in a good way, but the sequels, the second one really, like I've said, I think is sort of set pieces in search of a narrative. It feels like a linking part. The funny thing about it is, if I remember right, there were planned to be 4 sequels, and they actually planned out a 5-part story after the success of this first one, because obviously the first Omen was a big success, and because the second film wasn't such a big success, they knocked it on the head with a third film. The fourth one does turn up as a TV movie at some point later on. I've never seen it. The fifth one was written as a novel, I believe, and has never been filmed. So all 5 parts in the end did get made in one way or another. Whether they're the 5 parts that would originally have been made or not is impossible to say. The Sam Neill one, I think, is an okay film, but it's not as striking as this by any stretch of the imagination. Matt, you're about to say something?
Well, I'm trying to remember because I watched the remake rather than the original. In the original, is Thorne, is the ambassador supposed to be related? Is he with the president in the end at the funeral?
Yes.
Is that supposed to be the president? So
yes.
What's strange about the second film is he's seen with the president at the end of the first, which suggests that he's going to be adopted by the godparents of this ambassador. And then he ends up with the brother of the ambassador as an industrialist. Surely it would be much more exciting to have a film where he's the son of the president and it just carries on, except the president wouldn't be president anymore. But, there's something you were talking about. Why would a demon get into a girl in Georgetown? The whole point about possessing Damien is because the ambassador's going to rise in power, and because the ambassador's got this connection with the presidency of the most powerful man in the US. And then they kind of ignore that in the second one and just.
But I think the overall idea is it's about once they decide that there's, once the Omen's successful enough that they're looking at sequels, the idea then is that Damien goes on to become president himself.
Yeah.
And of course, the third film is about, I only watched it a year ago. I'm trying to remember, is he president or is he on the cusp of presidency? I think he's on the cusp of presidency.
On the cusp because it's set in England and he goes fox hunting. That's what I remember.
Yes, you're right. That's right. Yes, of course. The Omen, then. We're going to give it a score out of 10. Is there anything anybody else wants to?
Just a connection with the music. I think all 3 films have classical music in them, and they're used to good effect as well. But the music in Rosemary's Baby is very, very powerful. That nursery rhyme piece of music. The Exorcist uses Tubular Bells, but only uses about a minute of it. But yet that seems to be utterly brought on board. In fact, I think the director said they probably would have preferred Tangerine Dream if he'd have known they were around. So they just used Mike Oldfield's music and it stuck. And then the music in The Omen, Ave Maria, and all that sort of thing. Such powerful biblical music. It's supposed to be music to celebrate God, yet they use it in this completely turnaround way, which works so well. And that really, I don't know about you, Matt, but that really got me into classical music as well. That film.
It did get me into classical music.
Look behind you.
It didn't get me into classical music, but using religious music is appropriate, particularly with The Exorcist and The Omen, because they're religious films. They are Christian films.
Yes, they are, aren't they? Really.
I mean, they're basically.
It's all about
They're basically the directors acting as salesmen for religion, for Catholicism, bringing their products to the audience.
It's true.
One note on the remake of The Omen, I think But I think I watched it this week too, just by way of comparison on consecutive nights with the first one. And I think the sequel kind of basically relies on you knowing the first film. And it really kind of leans into the sort of sequel territory in that it sets up the set pieces, but doesn't really give you an awful lot in between. It just seems to be concerned with doing the set pieces. And the tension in the movie is, are they going to do the death the same as they do with the priest? Or are they going to do the death differently as they do with the photographer? And that seems to be the real tension in the movie. And you're right, Liv Schreiber, he's a brilliant actor in other things. In here, he's a real blank space. And yeah, once again, it's the actors around him that bring the story to whatever life there is.
I thought oddly the flaw of the remake is it's so similar to the original, and I think they got into trouble because it was written by the screenwriter on it wasn't allowed to have credit because he'd basically just rewritten verbatim scene for scene the original. Not
watching
quite like
on,
Gus Van Sant's Psycho.
Yeah. Oh no, it's not exactly. But watching them on consecutive nights, it is astonishing just how much of the dialogue is just repeated verbatim. And when you get to the middle of a scene and all of a sudden there's a sentence that's different, it's the sentence that's different that sticks out rather than the sentences that's the same. Some of it is just whole scenes repeated without any changes whatsoever.
But I quite liked it. I didn't mind it at all. Not quite my experience of watching the Sam Rockwell version of Poltergeist recently. I much preferred that version to the original. I really liked the remake of Poltergeist. This one isn't better than the original, but it's not bad. It's all right. It's just, what's the point?
I've not seen the first Poltergeist for many, many, many years. Maybe that's another one to put down for next Halloween.
We'll see. Like if Spielberg made a horror film, basically.
well, Close Encounters is a bit like if Spielberg made a horror film, or Duel, or Jaws, even. In fact, Spielberg was making not quite horror films for the first few years of his career. But anyway, a score for The Omen. Matt?
8.
Fair enough. Simon?
7.
That's 3 7s from you. That's kind of disturbing in a religious kind of a way. I'm going to give it a 10 because this is one of those movies that, despite the fact that I know it's not really any good, I just enjoy it so much despite the bit in the film set in the middle. It's one of those films I can just watch over and over and I still get everything out of it that I always have. So 10. Lee?
Dear. I'm agreeing with JR. Oof, that's good. That's good. It's got to be good, isn't it? That means we'll be friends. Oh, is this on live? Yeah, so 10. I'll give it a 10, despite the graveyard scene.
Okay, next time on Film Club, it's going to be slightly different because we are going to have 6 weeks of Doctor Who now. So we're going to be reviewing Doctor Who weekly. So instead of doing a Film Club episode, what I've suggested we do is take what would have been the next Film Club and divide it into 4 shorter Film Club Light episodes. So instead of doing all the films together in one go, we do them separately because I wanted to do 4 films that in the sort of lead up to the new Matrix movie, I wanted to do 4 movies that are sort of connected to those themes that came out in the late 1990s. So The Truman Show, Pleasantville, obviously The Matrix itself, and I can't remember what the other one was. There was another one as well. It's got out of my head for a second. But you know what I mean. There were a bunch of films.
Alice in Wonderland?
Yeah. Basically, there were a bunch of films in the late 1990s that sort of had parallel realities as a theme. And The Matrix was very much definitely a part of that sort of subgenre. So that's what we'll be looking at. And we'll be looking at them one after another. So Film Club next time will be slightly different from the norm. Until then, I was JR.
I was Lee.
I was Matt.
I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.